This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is the Bob Newhart Show from the 1970s, why it's a great show and why you should watch it. Diana Peterson is my guest. She has written about the Bob Newhart Show, both on a blog and in a book, and we will be discussing why it's a great show. So welcome, Diana. I like to give my guests a few minutes to give a little bit of background about themselves. So if you would, tell me a little bit about yourself, what you've written about in other books, and what draws you to the Bob Newhart Show.
Yeah, I've had a little different career maybe than most writers about TV. I spent the first half of my career in legal publishing, and then I became an executive director at a logging camp museum. And currently I'm the curator at the Chippewa Valley Museum in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. I've always loved history and I've always loved pop culture. And those two things kind of meet on, I have a blog I've been doing, I'm starting my 7th year. And I have a podcast that goes along with that. And then the books you mentioned, that's all classic TV. And my definition of classic TV is a little looser than some people's. And I have written other books. I've written a child's book about Paul Bunyan. I have a novel series about 4 sisters set in Indiana in 1950. So a few other things. Do a lot of historic work as my job on my books.
Well, if you enjoy this show, I definitely want to maybe have you back another time to talk about Paul Bunyan. I've recently done a number of folklore shows, and Paul Bunyan is an interesting example of what they call fake law. When it didn't come from the people as much as it came from a major company, and also some of the other shows too. But that's in the future. Right now, let's talk about the Bob Newhart Show. So. I was born in 1965, so the Bob Newhart Show is my first exposure to him. But for those who don't know Bob Newhart, and someone my age, he got famous first in the late 50s with comedy records. This is a thing that doesn't exist anymore. And his most famous routine was, picking up a telephone, and you'd only hear his end of the conversation. He might be calling his dentist. He might be calling George Washington or some other historical figure. How did you first come upon the work of Bob Newhart if it was not in the Bob Newhart Show?
Mine actually was also the Bob Newhart Show. I'm about 4 years older than you. So I do remember that Saturday night lineup with All in the Family, MASH, Mary Tyler Moore, Bob Newhart, and Carol Burnett. But yeah, Bob did start in Chicago in the 50s. He and a friend of his who were account executives, I believe, had all these funny phone calls, and so they turned it into that skit. And then he actually did have a show called The Bob Newhart Show in 61 and 62 for a season. He didn't enjoy it.
I think that was a variety show, right?
Yeah, and he likes to say he won the Emmy, the Peabody, and a Pink Slip all in the same 2 weeks. So
yeah, he was fairly big in the 60s early on, especially on the nightclub circuit as a stand-up comedian. Do you know how he first was approached to doing another show? I would have thought that the first variety version of his show probably left a bad taste in his mouth. So was he reluctant to do a sitcom?
I think he was a little bit. Jay Tarsis and Tom Patchett, who are writers and producers, have worked on a lot of programs. They talk about the fact that they wrote a script for, I think it was Love American Style, for Bob Newhart, but he wasn't available. And then they wrote a Mary Tyler Moore script, which they wrote for Bob Newhart, and he wasn't available. So then Grant Tinker asked them if they wanted to do a new show, and immediately they said yes with Bob Newhart. So Grant Tinker and his agent went to talk to him. It sounds like he was a little reluctant to do it, but he really, the schedule appealed to him to not be on the road. And he was one of the first stand-up comics. Now we think of Seinfeld, Roseanne, but that wasn't done then for a stand-up comic to come to television in kind of his own persona from the stage. But he did.
Now, you mentioned Grant Tinker. He was the husband at one point of Mary Tyler Moore, correct?
That's right. And they ran MTM, which produced Mary Tyler Moore and Bob Newhart, among other shows.
Yeah, and so Mary Tyler Moore, the MTM Enterprise with the famous little kitten instead of the MGM lion, was one of the I guess it sort of took over from Desi Lou as maybe one of the big producers of hits. That and the Norman Lear show. And of course, the Mary Tyler Moore show came on a couple of seasons before. She had been working with Dick Van Dyke. Then they had done, I remember, a TV special with Dick Van Dyke. And this got the Mary Tyler Moore show rolling. So, uh, was Mary Tyler Moore and her husband then actively looking for people other than Bob Newhart? I mean, it wasn't just Bob Newhart. What were they looking for in terms of
You
people to
know,
work with?
yeah, I don't remember all of them. I know they had a show about a resort where a group of people come together to work at a resort. I don't remember. They did Phyllis.
Yeah.
They did Rhoda.
Yeah.
But I don't remember a lot of other shows. But I know that they were looking for other shows to put into their partnership.
I know in the late '70s they also did WKRP in Cincinnati.
Oh, okay. That was them too. I didn't realize that.
Yeah. So when they did the show, was the I mean, sometimes a lot of shows they shoot 2 or 3 pilots, they go through mutations. In this show, Bob Newhart plays a psychologist named Bob Hartley, and the show is split basically 50-50 between his wacky patients and his home life with a wacky neighbor and his wife, played by Suzanne Plachette. Was that the original concept for the show, or is that something that took 2 or 3, pilots to work through and get to, oh, he'd be great as a psychologist,
Yeah, yes and no. So they knew right from the beginning they wanted an occupation where he could listen, because that was just his thing, and he wanted to be able to respond. And so they talked about like an army colonel, they talked about a principal at a school, and then finally they decided they were actually going to make him a psychiatrist. And he said, no, I don't want people thinking we're making fun of mental health. I will be a psychologist, but not a psychiatrist. And Jay Tarsis was in group therapy at the time, and he said, well, I think this would be perfect. I'm in group therapy, and I think it would be a really fun concept, and we have a lot of fun people in our group. And then, so that was settled, but then the first pilot, which didn't air, Jerry Bonners, who plays the dentist, Jerry Robinson, he was another psychiatrist in the building, but he was totally opposite of Bob. He had, round seats and was more new age stuff, and the pilot just didn't work. And so they made him a dentist. And I think it was the 3rd or 4th actual show in this series that became the pilot. They moved it.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the people other than Bob Newhart himself. So the show was created as a vehicle for Bob Newhart, and let's start with Suzanne Plachette. I know that I've read that before, and I don't know if it's true or not, that she was the only actress that they really wanted. And she herself didn't think that she would be good at comedy because she was basically known as, in the late '50s to the early '60s, she was in The Birds by Hitchcock. She was known as sort of, not necessarily a sex symbol, but just a beautiful woman, and they didn't think that she'd be a right fit for Newhart. How did she get cast?
Yeah, it's really fun. The whole cast kind of were one and done's almost. Suzanne Plachette was really good friends with Bob Newhart, and they happened to be on an episode of The Tonight Show. And I forget if it was Jay or Tom Patchett or Lorenzo Music, but one of them saw them on the show and thought they had such great chemistry. They called him and said, we found your wife. And he's like, she's not missing. And they said, no, your wife on the show, Suzanne Plachette. And he said, well, I love Susie. We're great friends. And I don't know if she'll do it, but I would love that. And she did. And
you mentioned Peter Bonners, and I know that he later became a well-known TV episode director. What was his background and how was he cast? Was he an actor, or was he a stand-up comic, or what?
He was doing some work with an improv group called, I think it was called The Community or The Committee maybe, in San Francisco. And Bob Newhart then had worked with him on some movie. So he knew him, but I don't think he suggested him. But they were looking for someone. One of Bob's criteria was that he wanted this filmed in front of a live audience. And he knew that Peter Bonners could respond to that. And he really wanted the audience to kind of set the way the show was going. And so they brought Peter in.
Yeah, and it should be stated, 1972, That's when really I guess you would call it the the live audience really came of age, because through most of the 1960s, most television sitcoms were like My Three Sons. You know, they were just filmed, and you know, laugh tracks were added later. I think Lucille Ball, throughout her career, was maybe the only star who went through a number of television shows where she propagated that whole through a live audience. Was that a concern that that it wouldn't play as well if they had filmed it as sort of a dramedy or something, or was it always going to be in front of a live audience for that natural reaction?
As far as I know, that was just something that Bob had really. He only had a couple. I won't even call him. He seems like such a nice guy. Demand seems like a strong word, but one of the things that he really wanted was the live audience. That's how he was used to gauging how his performance was going.
Yeah.
And it's a big difference between the Lear shows and the MTM shows was the live audience. I think he felt that set them apart.
Well, weren't most Norman Lear shows, like All in the Family and Maude and the Jeffersons, weren't they also filmed in front of a live audience or
I
videotaped?
it was my understanding most of them were not, but I might be wrong. But that was one of the differences between the two companies because I thought that they had used some laugh tracks and some other things and some uh,
Well, I know, I've read that Bob Newhart himself did not want laugh tracks. It had to be actual audience laughter. He didn't want what they call it sweetening by using a laugh track. So was he against the laugh tracks then?
to be honest, I have not seen him even come up. I just know that he felt the live audience helped him gauge how the performance was going, whether people enjoyed things or not, and he responded a lot to the audience as much as they responded to him.
Now, one of the other characters that he worked with was Marcia Wallace, the character Carol Kester, and she later, for a whole new generation, became the voice of one of the major Simpson characters. I think it was Mrs. Krabappel or something.
Hmm.
And But yet here she is. You know, she has that almost like orange-haired afro for a white woman, skinny. She's sarcastic, and it's one of the, I think, first times that you saw someone in an office type situation in that kind of show where she sort of ran that office, and the bosses, the people who paid her, Jerry and Bob's character, were sort of subservient to her.
Yeah, and
How
Bernie Tupperman, the urologist.
Yeah, and how is she cast, do you know?
Hmm. Lorenzo Music and his wife saw her on an episode of Merv Griffin, and so they thought that she would be perfect for the character of Carol.
And the final main member of the non-patient cast was Bill Daly. Now, he had just come off a year or two earlier. He had like a, was it 5 or 6 year run on I Dream of Jeannie as Roger, the sort of dippy-headed buddy of Larry Hagman's character. And in a sense, he almost plays the exact same kind of character. The only difference is he's he's an airplane pilot in Bob Newhart's show and an astronaut in the earlier show. So was Bill Daly actively looking for another role, and how did he hook up with the Newhart crowd?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they approached him or he approached them. I know he and Bob had been friends back in Chicago when Bob first started writing his skits, the phone skits and the Abraham Lincoln marketing skit. He and Bill were doing Bill was in charge of a regional Emmy show in Chicago. And so they've been friends for a long time. And then he came out, I think it was originally for Steve Allen. They brought him out to Hollywood. And then he ended up on Jeannie. And they just thought he would be the great character. But I think they had an idea for Howard Borden, but I think Bill Daly pretty much said that. I think, not meaning to, but he said there's a lot of Bill Daly and Howard Borden. So
Um, Now let's talk about some of the patients then. I'll stick with just basically four of them. The three main patients, probably the most well-known one was the Elliot Carlin character played by Jack Riley. And he was sort of a defensive, small-minded, nasty kind of guy who you don't even know if he really had a heart of gold, but his character then later supposedly appeared through a number of other of the MTM productions in other shows. How is Jack Riley cast? Because he's probably the most well-known of the patients on that show.
Yeah, I don't remember ever hearing anything about his direct involvement. I know that whole therapy group where they were going to do therapy, but this group was brought in for one episode, and the audience loved them so much that that's how they became semi-regulars. Um, and he said that he was the deadpan. He was known as the deadpan comic, kind of never smiled, didn't react. So they were probably looking for a Jack Riley kind of person. So I'm guessing that's how that went. But yeah, it was just a one and done episode originally for all of them.
And then there was another character called Lillian, who was played by a woman named Florida Freebus, and she was sort of the granny with the sort of wisecracks about things. What do you know about her and how she was cast in that role?
I'm not sure how any, to be honest, of the therapy people were cast if they were just auditioned, but I know that they loved her in that role, and she had been in a couple sitcoms before. I think she was in one with William Demarest in the 50s. So she was a character actor, had a wealth of experience. And I know that Bob Newhart always talks about one of his very favorite lines on the show was given to Florida, and they were having a funeral for a member of the group. That's a whole nother funny story that got killed by a truck of zucchini. And at that, she said something like, well, and he was so much like my husband. My husband just could never, ever stop and smell the roses. And it's odd because he was a florist. And Bob Newhart said that was one of his favorite lines on the entire series. He said he just loved it, captured her so well.
Well, I wanted to talk about two other of the patients. Probably the guy with the longest history in Hollywood was actor John Fiedler, who played Emil Peterson, he was the typical little guy who was henpecked. I think in a couple of episodes you saw his wife was a big, large woman twice his size who was always bullying him, and he did movies back from the late '40s on. Do you know anything about his background and how he got into the show?
I don't. He's on my list of someone. I know most of us know him from Disney. He was the voice of Piglet, so I think a lot of people recognize his voice.
That's right.
He was a prolific character actor and someone I would like to learn more about. But apart from knowing that he was in, I think the group in general were in 15 to 20 episodes of 142. So.
And the one other character that's important that I'm going to get back to when we talk a little bit about some of the more interesting episodes and whatnot. I mentioned Howard Hessman. I think I mentioned WKRP in Cincinnati, and Howard Hessman was one of the stars of that show. He played Dr. Johnny Fever, but he played in a handful of episodes a man named Mr. Plager, who was homosexual. And I remember just watching recently in the last couple of months is a fellow named Matt Baum who does a history of homosexuality and the culture of Hollywood. And he did an episode. There was a well-known episode where the group members that we just mentioned didn't want to appear with a gay character played by Hessman, and Hessman then later appeared in a few episodes. What can you tell me about Hessman and how he was cast in that role? And then we can talk about the episode itself.
Yeah, quite honestly, I don't know if he came into audition or if they had him picked out. I don't know how he got cast in that role.
So let me pick up on the Howard Hessman character in that episode, because as I said, it seems to have been one of the earliest episodes in American television where homosexuality was treated with some bit of seriousness. I mean, given that it was in a sitcom situation. This was at an era when there was controversy over whether homosexuality was a mental illness or not. In some states it was illegal. Well, at least the homosexual acts were illegal. And here comes an episode where Bob Newhart is dealing with this head on, and even his character Bob Hartley is first a little discomfited in the presence of this gay man. And as I said, I've seen a handful of videos about the episode with gay history. What do you know anything about the episode, how it came about, and because it seems to me that Newhart himself there was quite a. Did he have to fight to get that on the air? You know.
I wish I could tell you more about that. And I don't know the story of a lot of the individual episodes.
Okay.
I know, yeah, I would have to go back and I think I first wrote about Newhart probably 4 years ago. So I would have to go back and refresh my memory on just, I know that he wanted to bring him in and I know that it was handled very well. And it was always said that that was one of the ways they showed one of the great ways to stand up for gay people. And it was a classy way to do it. I've heard that a lot, but I don't know how it came about.
So the show then debuted in the fall of 1972, correct?
Mhm.
And the handful of episodes in the beginning, there seems to be more emphasis, as you said, there was only supposed to be, what, a couple of dozen episodes that featured the patients. What was the initial setup for the show in terms of the characters, and how did they change? How did Bob's and Emily's roles change, or if they did during the show? Was Howard, for example, seems to get dumber and dumber as it goes on. If you look at the first few episodes, he seems to be at least a semi-competent adult, but as often happens in sitcoms, they dumbed him down. And I think Peter Bonner's Jerry Robinson character also went from being a bit more cynical to being a bit more likable. Talk to me about sort of the dynamics of the main cast.
Yeah, I think that's true. I know that they use Bill Daly a lot as Howard is. They said if they ever had a scene in an episode that was weak, they would literally just write him into it for a couple minutes because the audience loved him so much and he could get away with things. I know that Newhart talks about one time they had to fill some air, and so they brought Howard in, and Bob was asking him about, oh, with bad weather now, you must love this new technology and the sophistication of the instruments on your plane. Like he was flying to Hawaii and he's like, oh, Bob, not really. In a storm like that, I'm better off just to put my ear out the window until I hear the ukulele music. And then he walked off. Bob said they would do stuff like that to him all the time just because the audience liked it and he made it believable. They said people felt like that really was his character. But I agree. I think that they took that one overboard a little bit.
Yeah.
It made Howard, he was likable, but you don't want him to be stupid. You want him to be quirky.
And how about the Jerry Robinson character? They seem to tone him down. He seemed to be more abrasive originally.
Yeah, I think he was cynical and I think he was self-centered and just not too caring. And I think they just made him be a better friend. I think as he got closer to Bob and to Marcia, I think he opened up and just showed more of himself. And I think you learned more about him and saw the whole person instead of just a stereotype.
Yeah, and what they did also with the Bill Daly character, Howard, they gave him, well, they made him a divorcee, and we meet the ex-wife, and then his little son we finally see, played by a kid named Moosey Dryer, and that there's an arc over the course of the series there, I think, that's meant to humanize Howard. And in a similar vein, Carol goes from being a little bit bitter. It seems like she can't get a date. She's got this odd look. She's an odd look, almost like a tall, thin stalk. She has that, rail thin kind of look to her. But over the course of the show, she has a number of boyfriends. And doesn't she get married late in the series?
She does, yeah. She marries, yeah. And Marshall Wallace brought a lot of her real life to that character. Marshall Wallace had a really rough life. I don't remember what all of that happened, but I know that she had lost a lot of weight at one point. But she had breast cancer, I believe it was. It took her a long time.
I think she even died of breast cancer 40 years later or something.
Yeah, it took her a long time to meet a guy, and she met, they said, this marvelous, handsome, wonderful man, and then he died a couple of years into their marriage. And yeah, she had a really rough childhood, so I think she had a very sad, troubled life, and they said that she brought a lot of that into the character of Carol.
And how did they develop the Emily character? A couple of episodes that I remember standing out for me. One is when she is in a supermarket and one of the bag boys sort of makes a kind of comment about how good she looks, and Bob gets a little jealous. And in another one, I think she's up for some promotion, but the principal of a school, because she's an elementary school teacher, is like not sexually harassing her, but giving her a hard time or something. How did they develop her character so that she's not just an appendage to Bob?
Well, I think right from the beginning, that was something that was really important to them. You know, some of the executives wanted them to have children, and the original pilot actually had them trying to adopt, and were kind of told by the social worker that they'd call them later. And Bob and Emily both, or Suzanne, both said no. No, we don't want to have kids. We don't want that kind of sitcom. We don't want to be the dopey dad or the nagging mother. Um, and so right from the beginning, they said they just wanted to concentrate on them as a couple. And I think it was very important that they both came off. She's funny and she's smart. She's stubborn. She has, you know, a lot of wonderful traits, and she has some traits like stubbornness that we all have. And Bob too can be stubborn in things. And they were just equals, I think, right from the beginning. Um, you could tell sometimes they would fight and get really mad at each other, but they loved each other, they respected each other, and they were a unit, and that's the way it was going to be.
Um, I know there was a story, I'm sure you probably know it, they had actually written an episode later on in the fourth or fifth season where she's supposed to get pregnant, and they gave the script to Newhart. He looks at it and said, "It's great, but who are you going to get to play Bob?" or something like that.
Yeah, he was very, you know, sure in that. So what happened, the season was going to be their last. Bob had decided he wanted to be done, and that script was written as the finale. And then they told Bob how much they'd pay him for one more year, and the cast talked about it, and they decided to do one more year. And so now this was no longer the finale, and I think they had left the script where they were going to try to have a child. And yeah, he said it's a great script, but who are you going to get to play Bob? So that became a dream sequence instead.
So, well, we'll get to dream sequences later on, the more famous one. Uh, but I wanted to talk about some of the episodes. Well, let me ask you if you could give me two or three of what you think are either your favorite episode and the best episodes, and why, and then I'll mention a couple if they're not yours. Go ahead.
Well, I will tell you the two best ones. These aren't my two personal favorites, but that come up over and over and over from fans, and from a couple people is they call it the Mugu Guy Pan episode, but really it's I think it's called Over the River and Through the Woods. And Emily is gone for Thanksgiving, and Bob has Howard and Jerry and Mr. Carlin over. And as they're watching sports, they get really drunk and then decide to order Mugu Guy Pan. And so a lot of people love that episode. And then the other one that gets talked about a lot is Emily has to do an IQ test for her class, and she talks Bob into taking one, and she comes out higher than him, and he's not very happy about that. Yeah. And then he is her +1 to attend a meeting, and he's not very gracious at that. And they have some great things. I think it's Patchett, one of the producers, was in that as an actor. And Bob walked in, and Emily, and he talked about how he can name things backward. And Emily said, "Oh, well, I'm Emily Hartley." And he gives her name backward. And he looks at Bob. He goes, "And you?" And Bob said, "I'm Bob." And there's just this pause. And the guy said, "Well, not much we can do with that, is there?" So, but because she was smarter than him and he had to accept that, I think people liked that episode. Personally, I love the episodes with the Peeper, Tom Poston. I think he was a great character. He was Bob's college friend and, you know, the prankster. But then whenever they got together, Bob kind of turned back into this, you know, college kid, immature a little bit. And the Peeper kept growing in his relationships and wanted to move on as a friend. And I think that was kind of harder for Bob. Once the Peeper got married and wanted to have kids, Bob had to grow up too when he was with him. But I think Tom Poston was great. And actually, Suzanne Plachette and Tom Poston got married. Yeah. I think it was after after Newhart, but
many years later. And
yeah.
it's interesting because we'll talk about the connection between the Bob Newhart show that we're talking about and the later Newhart show, because Tom Poston was a major character in that one. And a lot of people have often said that, well, for those who don't know, there's a connection that comes to the end that we'll get to that brings it all back to the original Bob Newhart show, the sitcom. But a lot of people have thought that there's a connection between the Peeper and the character that Tom Poston plays on Newhart, because the Peeper is from Vermont, I believe, too, which is where the second
Oh,
series is set. But we'll get to that in a bit. I I do remember one of the things I liked early on was there was an episode where also not only is Emily supposedly smarter than Bob, but there's an episode where I think there's like a tennis pro who develops a crush on Emily, and Bob is sort of questioning his own self-worth. He's like, well, I mean, Suzanne Plachette was gorgeous, and Bob Newhart's an okay-looking average man, and he's wondering like, how did I land her and whatnot? Do you remember that episode?
yeah. Her tennis instructor is gorgeous, and I think he comes to see Bob because he says how hard it is to be so good looking, and how the women fall over him. And I think Bob makes a wry comment like, or he said, "You would never understand that," or something, and Bob's like, "Right, or probably not." So yeah, and I think he did realize that Suzanne was desirable to a lot of people, but I think it also maybe gave her more confidence. He knew she was attracted to his sense of humor and his wit and his intelligence.
Another, I'm just flipping through some of the episodes. Another one that stands out in my mind is the episode called Emily in for Carol, where Carol goes on a vacation. Carol Kester's played by Marsha Wallace, and that Emily sits in and does a terrible job filling in for Carol, and Bob basically has to tell her that she's doing a terrible job. Do you recall that episode?
I do a little bit. I don't remember that one as well. I know there's a similar one too where they're playing tennis and Emily wants to be his partner, but he really wants to win, so he's really struggling because it's an office thing. And does he take his wife and be the good husband, or does he take a partner that he can win with?
Yeah.
I think there's a couple.
An episode, just flipping through that, actually, I guess you would call them nowadays an arc of episodes, is where Jerry Robinson goes looking for his natural family, I believe, and it turns out he's very rich, or he inherits a lot of money, and this makes him, for the first couple of years of the series, he went from a more distant character to a more likable character, and this sort of sets him back again. Do you remember that episode?
Yeah, I kind of do, and I don't remember it in detail, but I remember that, and it seemed like they kind of went into a weird pattern with him too then, because then at one point he takes off. He gives up his practice, and Bob's telling him, "This is ridiculous, you'll be back," and he does, but he leaves, and I don't know, to find himself or something. I can't remember.
Yeah, he
But
ends up on a desert island, I think.
yeah, and I thought that was I thought that one thing was a little unrealistic. I don't have very many criticisms of Bob Newhart show, but I didn't like that direction. I guess that they were going.
So I'm just looking through here. Newly wealthy and retired Jerry goes on a quest to find his biological parents. Okay, that's since 1976. That's like the 5th season. So getting to season 6. So you said that they wanted to wrap up after 5 seasons. Oftentimes, what happens when shows like Friends went on for way too long, Seinfeld went on probably 3 or 4 seasons longer. The Simpsons obviously has gone on several decades longer than it needed to. But what do you think of season 6? Do you think there was a drop in quality from the other seasons?
I don't think it was too bad. I think it was always Bob Newhart's intention to leave, and I don't know if it had anything to do. Dick Van Dyke really did it right. The Dick Van Dyke show, they ended on a really high note, and I think not many other series did that. They all went on too long until ratings fell, and I think Bob really felt he wanted to get out before that. He wanted to go out where everything was still quality, and they weren't repeating scripts, and they weren't um, just doing shows that were so. But I really didn't see any quality fade during the whole time they were on. Had they gone on a couple more years, I'm sure it would. And I think a lot of characters were ready to move on too. Peter Bonners really wanted to get on with directing.
Yeah. I'm looking too here. So it seems that Bob Newhart himself he wasn't in 5 of the last season's episodes. Was that because he had other projects that had been scheduled before they decided to renew for a final season? Do you know?
No, because what I've always seen is that he and Suzanne Plachette were the only 2 that were in all 142 episodes.
Okay, because it said, I'm just looking here now. I'm looking on Wikipedia, and we take Wikipedia for what it was, but it says that in 5 there were like it says here, Grizzly Emily, 2nd of 5 episodes in the season shot without Newhart. Maybe they might have had him in an insert where he's calling Emily. I think
Yeah, maybe that's it. Because I'm sure he and Suzanne Plachette were credited with all 142, and then Bill Daly and Marshall Wallace were like 140.
Yeah. So one episode in well, let's talk about 2, but the last one, but the one episode before the last one in season 6 that I do remember just looking through the synopses here was the one called Grand Delusion, where Bob and Emily go to a restaurant and they imagine that they were married to someone else. Do you remember that episode?
Boy, I don't. You are picking up all the ones that I don't recall as well.
Okay. And then let's go episode 142. Bob and Emily prepare to leave Chicago for a teaching job at a college in Oregon. Now, I have to say, when I rewatched this, and the last time I watched pretty much through, I don't have the DVDs, but I've seen them online on YouTube or Daily Motion or whatnot. The last, probably about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, I just stumbled upon it, and then, you just watch one, you watch the other. I do think the ending could have been a little bit more convincing or whatnot. What was your take on the final actual episode of the Bob Newhart show?
I've always been torn on that one because it didn't seem realistic to me that Bob and Emily would really move from Chicago out to Oregon to a little town, and he would lead this idyllic, quaint life as a professor. But then I think, well, where do I think they would have ended up? And I'm not really sure. I know that they asked Suzanne Plachette one time what she thought happened to Bob and Emily. And she said that that Emily would have developed some kind of educational tool to help people, that she would have not gone on teaching, but she would have been doing these educational things, and that she and Bob would travel a lot. But I know that she also on the show had a fear of flying. So,
yes.
So I don't know. I've always tried to think where I would see Bob and Emily, where they would end up in their retirement life.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that was another good episode too, where they're on the plane, they're on the airplane, and she needs to get off, and then how does that? There's a twist to that episode. Do you recall episode? Because I remember that something happens there where there's a twist. You just brought that to my mind.
It is. I think she does get off the episode, and I think she goes home, and Bob has to finish with the patients, and she just couldn't do it, which I thought was another very realistic thing, that not everything has a happy ending. She.
Yeah. Now, it says here that Newhart was nominated for a couple of times for the Golden Globe, rather. Did he ever win any Emmys for it? I think.
No, this is one of my big gripes, and I understand. You're up against. I know that Jack Klugman was nominated quite a bit. Alan Alda, Carol O'Connor won it a lot.
Tony Randall won it once at least.
Tony Randall. So I understand that it's some pretty good competition. But on the other hand, and nothing against, but Jack Albertson, I believe, won one year, and Bob wasn't even nominated. And John Ritter was nominated one year, and Bob was not even nominated. And the show itself is only nominated one time as Best Series. and I think it lost to Mary Tyler Moore.
Yeah.
So I know that the cast felt they really lived in Mary Tyler Moore's shadows. And I think to some extent they probably did, because they're both great shows, but I don't consider, I guess I would give Mary Tyler Moore's show a little bit nod of being the better show, but I think they were both extremely well written. They had great characters, a more sophisticated kind of writing and focus on relationships. So they were very similar sitcoms.
Do you think that the MTM company pushed Mary's show because she was Mary?
Sure, I think I think they probably did. I know Bob Newhart won his first Emmy for The Big Bang Theory as Professor Proton. That was when he won his first Emmy, which I think is a shame. So I think Bob Newhart deserved more nominations.
Let's turn then to Bob Newhart's later shows, and let's talk about Newhart, because Newhart picked up, I think that started in 81 or 82, so 3 or 4 years after the Bob Newhart show ended. And in here, he's sort of playing a fellow named Dick Loudon. I think he's a writer of help me, how to do books, how to fix the barn, how to do this. And he and his wife move up, played by Mary Fran, move up to Vermont. Tom Poston, who appeared as the Peeper in the original show, now is the dim-witted Howard Borden stand-in, basically, for that show. He's the handyman who doesn't really know much about anything, maybe other than being a handyman. And then it started, the first season, there was sort of a snide fellow who was on the show. They got rid of him for 1 year. Then they brought in Stephanie, a blonde, and then Peter Scolari's character, who was sort of these preppies. But probably, other than Newhart himself, the most famous characters was the trio, the Three Stooge-like brothers, Larry, Darryl, and Darryl. Yeah, Larry, Darryl, and Darryl. And that ran for, I think, 9 seasons. And I think that was a good show, 3 or 4 years. But I think that show doesn't hold up as good as the Bob Newhart show, because it went 3 years longer. But one of the things that they did, they had probably, if not the most memorable ending in American television show history, it's certainly in the top 3 or 4. So why don't you take up and tell people who don't know what the ending was?
Yeah, that was such a great ending. So one night, Bob and Suzanne Flechette and their spouses were out to dinner. And Bob says it was at a Christmas party. Suzanne says they were in a restaurant. And it was about, I think it was 4 or 5 years into Newhart in his second show. And Ginny, Bob's wife, said, when you end that, it would be really great if you could do an ending that went back to the Bob Newhart show. And she set out the whole scene. And Bob's like, oh my gosh, that would be fantastic. Then never let us do it. And Suzanne's like, yeah, they'll never go for that. And so 4 years later, when it came time to end the show, Bob did share this with the producers, and they loved it. So what they did is they told the cast that Bob was having a dream sequence where he was up in heaven talking to God. And this is what they told the media, and it got leaked. But in reality, they built a secret set. They brought Suzanne in and hid her in a trailer for like 6 hours. Then they, right before they started filming that morning, Bob said, okay, I have to tell you the real ending. That's the first time the cast had any clue of how it was really going to end. And so at the end of the show, the lights go down and come up, and you're back in Bob and Emily's bedroom from the Bob Newhart show. And he said just the bedroom set, no one even knew they were there, got this terrific round of applause, and people were so excited. And then they sit up, and Bob says, Emily, you're not going to believe this dream I had. I was this innkeeper in Vermont. And she's like, no more Chinese food for you, Bob, or Japanese. And that's how they ended it. Yeah, I think that was one of the greatest endings.
Well, the background, too, is that, number one, this was the surprise ending started almost a decade before with the return of Bobby Ewing from Dallas, and it all being a dream sequence. So that was to parody that, the way that a lot of these, at the time, very popular not only nighttime but daytime soap operas would use. If a new writer comes in, they don't like the thing. Oh, it's just a dream, so we scrap that history. And then also the fact that there were many scenes within the Bob Newhart show where Bob and Emily were shown in bed, and they'd be arguing about something, and then one of them would say, "Good night, Emily," or "Good night." They turn off the lights. 5 seconds later, the lights go on again, and they continue arguing. And so that was basically what they did there, and it was. I think that was what was so good about that was, I think he says, oh yeah, I'm this innkeeper with this beautiful wife and blah blah. And lights go down, and then up again. It's Sam Plachette goes, "How beautiful was she?" or something to that effect.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, they said that bedroom scene in the original that was done as a nod to the Bickersons show that went way back.
Yeah, yeah. So when that show ended, I know in the late '90s so he had the Bob Newhart show twice. That's the same name, the variety show, the sitcom. Then it was just Newhart, and then he did a show called Bob.
Yep.
And I think that ran for just 1 or 2 seasons. He played a comic strip artist or something.
One year. Yeah, he played a comic book writer who retired and was trying to get back into work. And then it was 5 years later, I think he went and tried one more, and it was called George and Leo.
Yeah.
And again, that was a 1 year thing too.
And who was in that? With George and Leo.
Well, he played George Studi. He was a bookstore owner, and he offers a temporary home to a magician and part-time criminal. And I don't remember, to be honest, who played in that with him. I know Bill Daly said he was on every single one of his shows.
And I know that he said before he did that, George and Leo, I remember after Bob started, he said, "Well, I've got one more show in me. We're just going to call it because the Bob Newhart show." So he had Bob, he had Newhart, and so just the. But so let's wrap up then, and let me just ask you. You mentioned how you thought that the Bob Newhart show. You said you probably would give a slight edge to Mary Tyler Moore show. But how has the show stood up, do you think, over the 45 or so years that it's been off the air? I mean, is it still running on a lot of channels? The DVD sales is a good selling DVD. How do critics now look at that show?
I think it's increased, and I think critics appreciate it more. I know it's on Decades, and so for sure they run it every day, I think. I think it's been so well received. When it turned 40, there was a lot of articles and a lot of interviews, and I will say every single star on the show that I've watched interviews with, they talk about brilliant writing. They didn't ad lib because they respected the writers so much. Bob mentions all the time they had the most brilliant writers. And Bill Daly said he thought Jeannie was silly. He's like, everybody loved Jeannie, but it was silly. And he said we ad libbed all the time because the scripts were rotten and, the made for TV movies were just awful. But he said Bob Newhart was so special. And he said it's a more sophisticated kind of humor, and you have to appreciate that. It's not topical, it's all relational, and it's just due to brilliant writers. And it's kind of funny because you would think a show like that, where you have to know the characters so well, would be a small writing corps, but they had over 60 writers on that show. And some of them were partnerships, but 20% of them were women. And I'm sure Lorenzo Music and Davis really kept it consistent. They were credited with every script, so I'm sure they made sure that they all fit the character. But it was just a huge number of writers who really went on to do things like WKRP, Designing Women, MASH, Stoke, Carol Burnett, Cheers, Taxi, Frasier. Kind of kept that sophisticated comedy going with Frasier and Taxi and Cheers. I think these writers learned something on Bob Newhart they took with them that changed TV in the decade after.
Before we end up, and I give you a chance to sum up, I want to go back to something that you had mentioned earlier in the show. You talked about the CBS Saturday evening lineup of the early 70s with All in the Family, then MASH, then Mary Tyler Moore, then Bob Newhart, and then finishing with the Carol Burnett Show. Now, four of them are sitcoms, and four of those sitcoms are probably in any reasonably good critic's idea of the top 20, 25 sitcoms of all time. And if you're just talking comedy shows, you can add the Carol Burnett Show in there. And I've always argued that the golden age of television wasn't the 1950s, and certainly not now in this, what I consider a very watered down era. I don't think you can beat from the late 60s to 1980ish or so, and especially for sitcoms. I think the 1970s was the absolute golden age for sitcoms. Do you agree with that?
I do. I really think and even just that one night, I will say I do have a bias where I am not a big Norman Lear fan. I love Norman Lear. I think his shows were really important and necessary and moved the industry in a totally different way. But if I'm going to sit down and watch shows, All in the Family, Jefferson's, Maude, they're just not what I enjoy watching. It kind of led to some of that dark comedy, like One Day at a Time, that had a lot of dark bits to it. But I think if you're looking at well-written shows, you have to say All in the Family, Maude. My very favorite shows, some of my ever, apart from Dick Van Dyke Show, is MASH, Mary Tyler Moore, the Bob Newhart Show. I think it's hard to find three shows that were better written than those three.
Yeah, and the MTM shows too, they don't age as well. Yes, as poorly as some of the shows. Not that Maude or All in the Family, they're still well written, and you can watch them and still laugh. But if you don't know who, say, a government official in the Nixon administration was, some of the jokes are going to be like, I don't get that. Whereas if you're watching Mary and Rhoda, or you're watching Bob and Emily, their jokes are going to be funny, or they were funny 100 years ago. They'll still be funny in 200 years because it's about a husband and a wife or two friends in the Rhoda Mary example.
Yeah, yeah, it's all relational.
Yeah. So let me just end this with you and ask you, for those who haven't watched the Bob Newhart Show, why do you think it's great, and why should they watch it?
I just think it works so well. The cast was very close. They said they went out to dinner every week after they wrapped up, and they spent all their time together in between. And I think that comes from the show. I think it's a group of really quirky people, but realistic quirky people. I mean, we all know people. We can look at these characters and find people, I think, in our lives that are very similar. Bob just had everything centered around him. His persona of the listener, the straight man, he just played it so well, and they all made it look effortless, which is maybe why they didn't get nominated for Emmys as much. But it wasn't effortless. It was a lot of work. And the fact that they respected their writers, and their writers gave them brilliant scripts to work with, I think that's probably its biggest legacy.
Well, I will link to your blog, The Right Life 61, for people. They can look at your work there. I want to thank you for spending about an hour speaking about the Bob Newhart Show.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun. I always love to talk about old TV, so